All right, well, let's get started. Hello and welcome to another LRS webinar. My name is Ryan Howarder. I'm with the marketing team here, and I will be your moderator. Today's presentation, LRS Response Services, Ransomware Lessons Learned. That's going to be presented by Chris Hill, is a security practice leader here at LRS IT Solutions, and Josh Brandt, Director of Emerging Technologies and Cybersecurity. Everybody's muted, but you can participate in a Q&A session that we'll have at the end of the session. To do that, you just go to the Zoom toolbar, click that Q&A button, and type in your questions there. The chat's also open. You can put stuff in there, and we'll monitor that throughout the session and then get to it at the end. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Josh.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ryan. And thank you all for being in attendance today. We appreciate the time, and hopefully you find value in the content that we're about to provide you and some of our lessons learned and customer lessons learned in some ransomware events that occurred. I will say right off the bat, hopefully you didn't come in anticipation of a bunch of flashy slides or a really decked out presentation. This is an event that we've done several times over the last few months, but generally it's been more of a conversation. So we do have a few slides just to kind of keep things on point, but really this is to be more of a conversation. And hopefully we have that interaction at the end with some questions that come in from you all. Chris Hill is also joining me. Chris has a wealth of experience and knowledge with some of the topics we're going to cover today, so I asked him to join along. I don't think that was in the original invitation that went out. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Josh. As everybody mentioned, or as Josh mentioned today, we're going to talk about ransomware and how it continues to be one of the most costly threats that organizations face. Beyond the technical impacts, ransomware events cause reputational damage, regulatory scrutiny, and operational downtime that obviously can take weeks to months to recover from. On the reputational damage side, things can go on for even years, right, from litigation and so on. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about how our response services team help clients prepare, respond to, and actually recover from these types of incidents. We're going to address the immediate crisis, but also partner with you going forward in order to address the likelihood and reduce the reoccurrence of the ransomware events that can and eventually, hopefully not, invade your organization. The webinar today, we're going to outline the core components of our approach, examples of how we engage with these real world events, and then, as Josh mentioned, the lessons learned, right? So we have been helping clients with these ransomware attacks, and obviously each one of them molds us a little bit different at the end of the day. And what we want to do is bring that information over to you as a client to help you better prepare and hopefully be able to be, I guess, more prepared for ransomware if and when it would occur. So, Josh?
All right. And if we could go ahead and advance to the response services slide. So as we've been going through these presentations and talking about these ransomware events, one of the common questions, or I guess maybe a comment that's come up is, I didn't really realize that LRS even did these things. So we wanted to take a moment here at the beginning to talk a little bit about our response services team and the types of activities and events that we engage in, just to kind of set the stage and give you an understanding of what we do and then how that applies to these particular events that occurred with our customers. So one of the focus areas of our response services is incident response, particularly around planning activities. So these are the things that happen before an event, right? And really that's kind of four critical areas. So there's policy development, where we will help you define what constitutes a security incident, because that's one of the real critical things, that when something bad happens, that you know what it is, you've identified it, and you know what your workflow is, you know what approvals are necessary to engage, like maybe that's with your cyber insurance carrier or other outside organizations. So we help you build those policies to ensure that there's no time lost when you have to make that declaration of an incident. Along with that, it's roles and responsibilities, making sure that you know who has accountability for what activities. I can assure you that during a ransomware event, it is a very chaotic time, and you don't want to be losing valuable minutes in figuring out who needs to be doing what and who needs to be the responsible party for what. So we can help you build that out in advance. Same way with establishing your critical contacts, putting your call trees together, know who you need to contact from law enforcement, cyber insurance, outside vendors, legal counsel, those types of things to, make sure that this process is as smooth as can be when it really does become chaotic. And then finally, tabletop exercises are something we do help you practice this, because ultimately we want all this to be muscle memory. When you are engaged in the event, you've practiced, you know what you have to do, you know who you need to work with, and that's kind of what we hope to achieve. Some of the after activities, so once an event has been declared, how we work with customers in an IR fashion is really typically focused around three things. It's containment, eradication, and business resumption. And we're going to talk a lot about those as we get into our examples today. But really, containment is about isolating the systems that have been affected, helping you disable compromised accounts, stop malicious traffic, and really, make sure the bad guys can't continue to do what it is that put you in this position. Eradication then is obviously getting out of your environment, making sure that there are no persistence mechanisms, and that it's safe then to move into that business resumption phase of recovery. The next kind of area that we fold into our response services is digital forensics. We do have a forensics team here on staff. We've got a really great forensics lab. And really what that's about is a few ways that we can engage, but it's helping identify potential entry vectors, ways that bad actors maybe performed privilege escalation within your environment, looking at compromised systems, and helping really what's probably been the most frequent use of this service is developing indicators of compromise so that we can help you stop the spread of malware within your environment. So, what are the hash values? What are some of the things that are common that the bad actors have been using that we can get into your tools? Sometimes that's identifying or bringing in IOCs that are publicly known, and sometimes we've helped develop them. And then finally, malware reverse engineering, which is kind of similar to the forensics, looking at binaries, again, really developing signatures and things like that to help you detect. So all these things fall under our response services offering area. And we've engaged with our customers in a few different ways to utilize these. And again, we're going to talk about these very specifically when we get into the actual events, but really the four ways we engage with customers have been following an IR vendor. So what we found is typically when a customer declares an event that they have a requirement to use a specific incident response team or vendor. Usually that's being dictated by their cyber insurance carrier. So in some engagements, we have come in after that vendor has done their assessment, their attribution, and declared an all clear. And then we've gone in and helped with the customer doing detection and really identifying potential threat vectors after that vendor has exited. In some cases, we've partnered with the IR vendor and we've worked at the same time where they've been focused on attribution, what happened and why, and we're focusing on recovery and getting the customer back into business. Sometimes we have engaged with customers in forensic data recovery. So this has been in legal situations where maybe data has become deleted and unrecoverable or missing, and we have to recover it using forensic tools. and then again, reverse engineering malware. So these are kind of the ways that we have engaged, and we'll talk about some of these as we get into the case studies. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris to get started with our case studies, because this is really the kind of the meat and potatoes of the conversation.
Well, thanks, Josh. And the first couple of case studies I'm going to cover, I'm going to talk kind of lightly, kind of a little bit more high level. Josh is going to get into a little bit more details in the case studies that he's going to cover. The two that I'm going to refer to are a little bit older in play, but they still make relevant information today, because at the end of the day, what we found out is, commons, errors, and omissions is what really led to these mishaps per se. So I'm going to first talk off about how Active Directory and Active Directory hygiene can play a critical role in strengthening your security posture. In the scenario that we worked with, we had an organization that kept an AD group that was named execs. And obviously that is the AD group that were the executives of the C-suite, all were part of the group relationship there. Obviously that group was granted access to sensitive data within the organization, but probably the bigger fault of that group is that it also granted domain admin privileges. So as you can see, you're probably already trying to figure out or following that this is not good practice by any means. So one of the things that we focus on, obviously, is Active Directory hygiene and privilege access management. With this scenario and the organization, the privileged users within that organization probably did not need to be domain admins, right, at the end of the day. And they also probably didn't need access to most of the highly sensitive data that was part of that executive group. So we know that bad actors like to target executives, right, from phishing campaigns and so on, just because of sometimes they're easier targets. At the end of the day, they get lapsed, they're busy. There's things that's happened within their daily schedule that keeps them being as vigilant as they should be. So the bad actor came in, typical phishing campaign. User took the bait, and one phishing campaign, credentials harvested, and the bad actor was a domain admin. Period. Right. So, at this case, implementing strong privilege access management practice along with AD hygiene. Right. I mean, if that group wasn't there or those users weren't part of that group, this would have never per se happened. Right. At the end of the day. So, the next case study I'm going to move on to, it kind of follows a little bit like scenario, but this in my mind came from lapse from probably the IT team a little bit more than anywhere else. But security and perimeter security is another area that we highly focus on. We have assessments that are built to specifically focus on the two areas that I've already covered, or the area that I covered, and also perimeter security. Our cyber risk analysis we ran at this organization, and we identified features within the firewall, UTM features within the firewall that the client had actually subscribed to and was paying for, but did not have enabled. Now, we're not exactly sure why they weren't enabled. Maybe testing, maybe other things were going on in the environment that UTM was not tuned properly, so on. But at the end of the day, the UTM features at the perimeter, at the firewall, were disabled. Again, another phishing campaign combined with the user error led to unauthorized access into the environment. UTM at the end of the day, once we did enable the feature, it stopped the ransomware from proliferating through the rest of the environment. But as you can imagine, it already had occurred, and some compromises had already happened. The other two things I want to point out, and I know Josh is going to get a little bit more detail about this, but both cases that I mentioned, the time of the events where they actually occurred, we could tell was pretty strategic from the attacker, from the bad actor's point of view. One of them was July 3rd around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So we're assuming that they're figuring that Fourth of July weekend and Fourth of July holiday and so on was coming. And the other one then was late Saturday night, early Sunday morning. And again, I'm sure they're assuming that the IT team didn't have eyes on glass and could use that time to, start causing the damage that they could cause. So, all right, Josh, I'll turn it over to you for case study number 3.
All right. So for these final examples, as Chris mentioned, the first couple we were pretty light on details. I'm going to dive in just a little bit more and talk more specifically about how the bad actors perpetrated the attacks. These are, real customer examples. So, I will say I'm trying to be very sensitive to privacy concerns. So I'm not really going to talk about, obviously names of organizations or really even products that were compromised for the most part, or specific tools that they were using. I don't want to disparage any vendors or anything like that. There are a few cases where it were, publicly known vulnerabilities that were exploited. So I will comment on those, but for the most part, I want to keep it very generic and really focus on the fact that these are 3 different ransomware events that occurred. These were fairly, well, I shouldn't say fairly, they were extremely impactful to these organizations. They were all perpetrated in different ways. And really our involvement was very different in all 3 of these. So what I want to show is, or get you thinking about really is, if this happened in my environment, what are all the things that we would need to do? Like what would be going on in real time if this were happening to me? Because that is one of the largest, I think, oversights of organizations when they, maybe they have BCDR and IR, business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident response plans put together. But when you're under that pressure of facing questions from, your internal employees and your customers and, regulators or whomever, and you've got people focused on recovery of data, if you've had a significant portion of your data estate encrypted, you may have your entire team working just on data recovery. And there are a lot of other components that have to be happening in synchrony with data recovery. And that's kind of how we've jumped in and helped in some of these. So I want to talk a little about 3 different engagements here. And again, hopefully you can kind of see some of the similarities, but also how these were very unique and how our response to each of them was very unique. So the first organization I'm going to talk about was a manufacturing company. They're fairly large. I think they have near 200 locations across the US. In this engagement, we were actually brought in after the fact. It was right when the incident response firm who they were using through their cyber insurance carrier had declared an all clear. This organization said, we want you to come in and help us identify other vulnerabilities. We don't want this to happen again, basically. And we want you to find any way that something like this could be perpetrated again, help us identify it and what we need to do to remediate. So that was kind of our portion of this. So some of the details that I have are really what were passed to us secondhand. But in this case, very similar to what Chris had mentioned, it was a phishing delivery method for the Emotet malware. And the way that it had worked was there was a fake invoice sent to the user. User thought it was real, opened the invoice, which then launched a script that pulled down some malicious code that launched on that computer. And then once that executed, then really it began moving laterally within the organization. That's kind of what Emotet did, for those of you who might be familiar with it. It's been around quite a while. It's been used in a lot of different types of malware attacks and ransomware. And in this case, Emotet leveraged the Eternal Blue, which was a Microsoft vulnerability several years ago. So we still run into it a lot, frankly, organizations that haven't patched Microsoft servers for this vulnerability, and it's extremely easy to exploit, I will say that. But in this case, they used Emotet to kind of move laterally. They were using the Eternal Blue to take control of the Microsoft environment, and then ultimately use the Ryuk ransomware as the encrypting agent within the organization. Within just a short matter of time, there were over 400 servers that had been encrypted with this malware. And this customer was using a third-party MDR. The MDR did notify them, but it happened so quickly. By the time that they found it, determined what was going on, and started to put protection countermeasures in place, it was over 400 servers that had been encrypted. So, obviously pretty devastating to their environment. I don't know the details, from a production impact for this client, because we did come in a little later. But I would say that it does kind of, well, actually, I want to back up. I apologize. The initial vector that was used, I mentioned, was phishing, but it was successful because the first 3 machines that were compromised did not have any form of endpoint protection on them. And that's something we'll talk about as kind of common in these cases. But the lack of EDR on these tools, antivirus and malware, allowed the initial exploits to be run. And then it was kind of compounding that with lack of patching for some known vulnerabilities in the Microsoft world is what allowed this to be perpetrated. So again, our role in this one was coming in after the fact and then looking for other ways that this customer could have been compromised. So that engagement for us took about 6 months to go through. As I mentioned, they had near 200 locations. They wanted us to look at endpoints, servers, processes, SDLC. There was a lot to investigate. So when you think about the loss of revenue from production, manufacturing being shut down, reputational damage, what they had to potentially pay in an IR firm, what they paid for their to customers, maybe they had contractual obligations. And then on top of that, us coming in for 6 months to help them do this study to just find things. I mean, kind of see how the dollars really start to rack up in that case. The next event I want to talk about was perpetrated. It was the Kylan ransomware gang. The first one was Ryuk. This one is Kylan ransomware, and this really started most likely, we think, with an OSINT, which is open source intelligence exposure. And for those of you that may not be aware, open source intelligence gathering or open source intelligence in general is just the information that's publicly available about you and your company, right? And this is something that we look at if we're doing a penetration test, for example, for a customer. We go gather all of the information that we can. We're looking for information about employees, compromised passwords, anything on the dark web, data dumps, anything that's available about this particular client. Well, bad actors do the same thing. They're constantly scouring the dark web. They're using clear web tools. They're looking for things that could be compromised or to be used to attack a victim, right? A business. And in this case, we think that's probably what happened. They somehow were able to access an identity and perhaps even a complete compromised credential set for this particular identity. But we know they were able to get a valid username. Also, then kind of where that expanded to was the customer had a misconfiguration in MFA that unfortunately failed open instead of failing closed. So when the bad actor used a valid username but had a bad password for the VPN went ahead and let them through, but they did have a valid credential into AD, and ultimately then were able to gain network access because of that. So they were able to get into the environment and do some detection and evasion actions, and kind of footprinted the environment, and were able to find some systems that were unprotected from an EDR perspective. So, that's something that we talk about regularly, and actually came up as a question in one of these presentations a few weeks back, and that does EDR need to be on servers, right? I think generally there's pretty good coverage on endpoints, but this customer said, I had never put EDR on my servers. Should I be doing that? And absolutely. In this particular case, the bad actor was able to determine both endpoints and servers that were not protected by EDR, and used that knowledge to be able to perform the encryption. And the way they did that was they knew that EDR didn't exist on these, but in their persistence in the environment, they were able to compromise credentials. Essentially, they enumerated the entire directory and were able to get users and passwords. And one of those was a domain admin. So when they started the encryption process, what they were actually doing is, from an unprotected machine, mapping drives to the workstations and servers that they were going to encrypt, kind of map it as a remote share, pull the file down locally, encrypt it, and then put it back. So that was the process that happened in the encryption activity. And to Chris's point, happened during off hours. There weren't people there to notice. EDR was flagging lateral movement events, but not blocking them, because it was a domain admin that was doing this activity. So that was really kind of how this one was perpetrated. The unfortunate event here was that the backups were affected as part of the encryption activity. So the customer did have multiple data centers. They had backups across data centers, but unfortunately, most of the backups were encrypted. So a lot of the recovery process was manual. It was finding data that hadn't been encrypted in various locations, and even user drives and things like that to recover. In this case, our participation was not as the IR firm who did the attribution. So that organization came in and they were looking for how did it happen? Why did it happen? Those types of things. Our focus was on containment, eradication, and business recovery. So we spent most of our time with helping this organization get back on their feet and get the business running again. So they had their team and fully committed and invested in data recovery, but they needed help with building laptops that had been encrypted, rebuilding Active Directory. As part of this encryption event, it affected everything from their backups with product that backed up to virtual servers, to their SIM. So all of their logs were encrypted as well. So there's very little useful data for being able to determine how exactly this happened and why. So the focus was on getting the data rebuilt and getting them operational as quickly as possible. So yeah, we had teams of people on site building laptops, helping do the things that they didn't have the resources to get done, but were critical and had to be done in synchrony with the data recovery. So this was a fairly large event. I think the impact to their customers probably spanned several weeks, and the time that we spent with this organization was probably on in the neighborhood of a few months, getting through the entire recovery process. So very significant, and again, kind of a different way that we worked with the client through the event. And then finally, most recent event that we've worked from a ransomware perspective was one that maybe you heard about. It made the news. I think it was in May, June timeframe, with RV Tools, and this is a virtualization tool. I'm not super familiar with the capabilities, but it was a compromised version. So this was a third party compromise. And for us, what we saw was a client who had actually been working a support case with Microsoft, and Microsoft instructed them to download RV Tools to help work this event or to work the situation. And they accessed a typo squatted or had some sort of search engine optimization poisoning, whatever the case may be. The technical person accessed an illegitimate website. It looked very much like the actual RV Tools, but it was an illegitimate website that pointed them to a compromised version of the tool that had a Trojanized installer embedded in it. So they pulled down the download, they executed it, and that launched Bumblebee malware within their environment, which is what in this case was used for kind of delivering the ransomware and other payloads within the environment. So it really just kind of bypassed their security tools and then was side loading applications within their environment. So Bumblebee started calling outbound, making connections to command and control servers that the bad actors had in place. And once those were established, pulled down a Conti ransomware and deployed Conti within the environment. This was again this was also a manufacturing customer, so similarly had their virtual server environment in multiple data centers impacted, significant customer impact. Again, in this case, we were not the primary IR, but we worked alongside the IR firm who did the attribution, because what needed to be done in this case was keep their production environment running. They knew that their back office environment was encrypted. It was going to be down for a long time, but we have to keep production up and running. So luckily they had a cloud vendor for their ERP platform. And what they came to us for was said, we need to have the network segmented. We want to ensure that nothing in the production environment can talk to anything in the business network to potentially have that affected. So really was a lot of network segmentation, re-architecture to get all of their operational technology and manufacturing environment networked and able to access the cloud and specifically their ERP platform. So they were able to at least produce. There were still a lot of manual activities that had to be done. The recovery process was very time intensive. In this case, they had to recover from tape and also asked for some assistance with the recovery from tape because it took several weeks to get their data recovered. But in all these cases, thankfully, the clients were able to recover. But these events, again, all somewhat different, illustrate various types of configurations or situations that can be preyed upon by bad actors. And that's kind of really what we want to jump to now is what we learned from this and what we want to share with our clients. So we advance to the failure points slide. Really, across all these events, there are three categories, and Chris mentioned these earlier, but it really comes down to errors, omissions, and misconfigurations is what we've seen. From the errors perspective, there are things like allowing simple or easily guessed passwords to continue to be used. It's something that we want to ensure that we have the ability to enforce strong passwords. Keeping data backed up and keeping auxiliary copies that are not part of the data center. So, offsite copies, if you have multiple data centers, having them back up to each other is great, but we still need a copy that's not available in those data centers, or we need immutable. Accessing illegitimate websites was also preyed upon, and this was a case that is very difficult to stop. The typo squatting, where in this case with the RV tools, maybe Microsoft had said to go to rvtools.com, and this person went to rvtools.org or something like that. We don't know exactly how it happened, but went to an illegitimate website that had the compromised, Trojanized version of the software that was deployed. On the omission side of things, we've seen not enabling immutable backups, even in cases where maybe the technology was present, they owned everything necessary, but they hadn't yet got to that point where they were enabling those backups. Not having EDR installed across all the environment. That's something I've spoken about several times recently, that it's really easy for a bad actor to, if they get access to your network, if they get on, behind your firewall, they're on your network, it's really easy to do a scan to find out which machines have EDR installed and which ones don't. So make it a priority to get the EDR installed. Delayed patching was also compromised in some of these scenarios. So, when known vulnerabilities come out, we need to get those patched. And then also an omission, the failure to do OSINT checks. And that's something that I would encourage. If you haven't done this, first of all, do penetration testing. But if you've not done pen testing, we'd be happy to work with you to do an OSINT check just to see what information is out there about you, and how can you minimize your digital footprint so that bad actors don't have so much to work with if they do want to attack you. And then misconfigurations, we've mentioned that we saw MFA misconfigured to a fail open rather than a fail closed. We've seen over permissive privileges assigned. Lack of segmentation, and then lack of egress filtering from a firewall. So Chris mentioned our firewall assessments, and that's something that we look for is, how do we, are we blocking this outbound traffic? That if we can prevent access to those command and control servers, then we can block a lot of the malware from being able to execute. So those are some of the things we've learned. And here we'll advance to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Chris to talk a little bit about some of our recommendations.
Yeah, so Josh, I think in each one of the scenarios that we've been involved with, obviously we've learned to as a team, we've learned things that we can do to help other organizations. But one thing we've learned here internally is that we have tooling available, and we can address some of this with our tooling that we have available. So we've developed some security assessment tools. And particularly, we have our cyber risk analysis, which in a lot of cases, with this tooling, we're able to identify a lot of these errors and omissions, right? That allows organizations to be more vigilant. You mentioned pen testing. Again, another great asset that organizations should take advantage of. I think one of the failures in my mind that I see organizations that go through assessments, any type of assessment, be it our cyber risk analysis or pen testing and so on, is really taking that report and doing the after actions, right? So a lot of times in events, we find out that the client may have known about this and didn't have the manpower, didn't have the time, or didn't have the knowledge in order to really correct or take corrective action. So if you're doing assessments, and it's something that we highly encourage, something as Joshua, we can most certainly help, but don't just throw that report in the drawer, right? Let's take that report and understand the report and see what we can make heads or tails of it, and make those corrective actions. In the cases, that we find is that, like I said, a lot of times some of this was known. Not all of it was known, but at the end of the day, some of it was known. Another thing that we focus on a lot and we recommend a lot is there's tons of security tools out there. Very advanced security tooling, right? Josh, part of your role here is in emerging technology and finding those advanced security control tools that are available. But if most organizations would focus on the basics would allow them to, per se, not necessarily need to invest in these high-powered tools if we're just covering the basics. And when I say focus on the basics, multi-factor authentication, weak passwords, AD hygiene, perimeter security, vulnerability, all the things that we talked about that can be taken care of at an organizational level without spending a ton of money, right? At the end of the day. So, as I mentioned, we have these tooling available. These lessons that we learn, we take those lessons learned and incorporate that into your tools, right? The tools that your team is running. So we're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to be vigilant for our clients. And obviously, we would love to continue to grow and know more about your organization and help you through these. And if it's assessments, framework alignments, risk assessments, pen testing, all those things are readily available from your team.
So, yep, absolutely.
All right.
And even beyond the more kind of operational elements, providing kind of strategic services and being trusted advisors, we can certainly help with designing your strategy. I mentioned earlier our incident response services where we help build your IR plans and tabletop exercises and those kinds of things. The strategic part of preparation, not just the operational side of things. So absolutely can help with all that. So I think we jump to the conclusion and.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, ransomware is going to continue to be prevalent out there, right? Whether we're ready for it or not. These attackers are using simple exploits in most cases, that taking advantage of those misconfigurations and omissions that are usually somewhat prevalent in most environments. So we're here to help. We want to be what we consider ourselves as a valued partner. We're not in that for the volume. We want to be, as Josh mentioned, trusted advisors, part of your team that helps make these decisions and they can help you focus where you need to focus. So that's really, I think, our story and our mentality. Josh has built a fantastic, if you haven't had a chance to work with Josh and Josh's team, I would most certainly take Josh up on a conversation, right? Take time, spend it with Josh, spend it with Josh's team, understanding where we can control and help control significant errors in your environment. With that, I'll conclude. Anything else, Josh, you want to add?
No, I don't think so. So not sure if we had any questions come in. Katie, Ryan, I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, we did have one come in, and as we asked that, I'll just make sure to remind you that you can participate by hitting that Q&A button and typing it in there, and we'll get to a few of these, and hopefully some more come in. This one is, you mentioned that you offer a cyber risk assessment. How does that differ from a pen test?
So, yeah, that's a great question. And we've got a lot of content, actually some literature we can send if you want to reach out to us. I think we've got our contact information on the last slide. But in brief, the cyber risk analysis is kind of the inverse of the pen test, where with it, we look at very specific areas. We look at Active Directory, we do a comprehensive security assessment of AD, of your firewalls, and then of your just internal and external vulnerabilities, because we know those are things that are always preyed upon by bad actors. We do this comprehensive analysis of all of those things and then give you a report on, here are all the things that you need to fix in each of these environments. So it's very prescriptive. Here are 25 things, misconfiguration, an error here, something you need to turn on here. Where with the pen test, it is similar, but it's going to be much more of a story. It's an attack chain. So we found this one particular weakness. we were able to exploit it. We did these things. We moved around and we figured out a way to access your environment and show that we could have exfiltrated data. So you get a great story about that one thing, but it's not as broad. It's here are the things that we found and we leveraged, not a listing of all the things that we looked at that maybe could be used, but we didn't actually leverage them. So what you get out of them is definitely different. And that's a great, we could spend quite a bit of time going through that comparison. So would love to have a conversation with you about that.
Yeah, that's judgment. We do have a whole chart that kind of spelled that all out because we get this question a lot, right? So.
Yep.
Excellent. We did have 2 or 3 questions here about the recording, and we will share that probably early next week with the registration list. So that'll be coming. So this one is kind of a teed up question for us, and that is, Josh or Chris, what is a question you wish one of the attendees would ask?
How can LRS help? No, yeah, really, all kidding aside, I mean, I mentioned it, but really, we want to be a valued partner. We know that you work with a lot of security vendors, a lot of security providers. We would love to work alongside your team and those things. We've shown that we can do that, and we can do that very successfully. So when it does come to selecting a security partner, we would at least love to be considered. So anything from you? Yeah.
No, I think that's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, that's all the questions that have come in. We've got Chris and Josh's contact information on the screen here. So please reach out if you have any questions, if we can help at all. We'll be in touch in the next week to send the link to the recording as well as some other resources. And but we're always available, and we are, as Chris said, we're glad to help and want to partner with you. So with that, I'll thank everybody for your time today. Chris, Josh, for the presentation, and everybody have a great rest of your day.
Take care.
Thank you all.